RoboCop Rogue City is a very special game. It's a game that does many things very well, from its writing to its environments and its characters, and its simple but satisfying gameplay. But it's also a game that fumbles many others, from its progression, its encounter design, to juggling multiple plot threads and losing steam through repetition. But most of the things it tries to do are unique, fresh ideas, interesting blends of others, and most importantly, it does them all with genuine passion that can be felt as you play through it. There is an undeniable charm within what we commonly call AA games. Games that stand where RoboCop Rogue City does. Not quite AAA, but not quite indie. Those games that used to retail for slightly lower prices, $50 or $40 compared to the old big release standard of $60 during the last 3 generations. This unique spot was filled with games brimming with ambition. They still had the creativity we associate with smaller indies, but they also frequently pushed up against technology and more technically complex ideas, using the same engines and backend as many of the bigger AAA releases, but with an eye for newer uses of the same tech. Of course, for every Mercenaries 2, there was always a Chili con Carnage. Not everything that can shimmer is gold, but that spark as well as that positioning in the marketplace has disappeared in the last years. There are still franchises that survive and are still beloved, things like Earth Defense Force, for example. But there's far fewer Urban Chaos Riot Responses, or Mad Worlds, or Red Factions, Chronicles of Riddick, and Deadly Premonitions. The special place occupied by games like those is now mostly occupied by horrible games that simply mimic the big budget ones but poorly, and charge you a bit less to enjoy their outright mediocrity, with there being 3 examples this year, with Gollum, Rise of Kong, and The Walking Dead. But RoboCop Rogue City also released this year, and it's a shining beacon in the dark of a type of game I thought long forgotten. Now let's be very clear from the start. This game is not going to be for everyone. It's far from perfect, and I will be covering the things it does wrong, but I believe there are many people that will deeply enjoy what is on offer here. The best way I can describe it is that it's a game that only cares about doing exactly what it wants to do, and it does that very well. And what it wants to do is tell a kick-ass, cheesy, heartfelt story that would have been a box office hit 30 years ago, within a very unique universe that many people haven't explored, especially in 2023, and cover it all with fantastic writing and humor, and make you feel like the walking refrigerator of death that is RoboCop. I'm going to cover the game in the following order: the things I really like about the game, and then I will slowly transition to where it could be better, and then where it's pretty bad, and at the very end, the parts that I really dislike. And that will require some spoilers, but I'll clearly mark them and give warning for them. So welcome, I'm Mugthief, and this is an in-depth analysis of RoboCop Rogue City. If you want an immediate comparison point for Rogue City, I would say that it falls somewhere between Urban Chaos Riot Response, a very late 6th generation shooter by Rocksteady, and Chronicles of Riddick Escape from Butcher Bay, the 2004 first-person adventure game / immersive sim by Starbreeze in 2004. A lot of that DNA is carried forward through RoboCop, that also had me remembering other games of that Starbreeze ilk, like The Darkness. Teyon, the developer, seems to have picked up a lot of influences from these games, since really they're a new studio. Teyon previously produced casual shovelware, and later on a bunch of DSiWare and WiiWare games. But in 2018, they sent all of that out to their new subsidiary, Digital Bards, and suddenly decided they wanted to make good games. Their first swing was Terminator Resistance, a game that wasn't exceptional but was reasonably well received with a bit of a cult following. Their second serious outing is RoboCop, and boy am I excited for whatever Teyon does next. And I want to throw this in here since I've seen a lot of people say the opposite. You do not need to be familiar with RoboCop to appreciate this world, this story, this gameplay, nor these characters. It helps but I last watched RoboCop maybe 8 years ago and remember only the general concept of it, and I never felt that detracted from my experience. For something classified as a first-person shooter though, about 50% of your experience or more in this game will not be shooting, much like in those Starbreeze games. You spend a lot of time in this game walking around, talking to people, doing side quests, and solving stories that function as vignettes, often very funny, although that is highly subjective, that have a lot to say about the RoboCop universe. You constantly switch between linear corridors of shooting, followed by more open-ended hub spaces where you can pursue the other optional shooting corridors or just side activities, and take in the ambiance of this cyberpunk Detroit. If this fact is enough to make you turn away, I'll try and convince you regardless, but what's coming next doesn't really help. The action sequences in this game are very different, and some would say very old. I don't know if this is the result of creating a game that is true to the RoboCop character, or due to its influences from the past, but there are a lot of quirks in how this game works compared to the last 10 to 13 years of first-person shooters. You move slowly. If you're wondering how slow, well, more or less as slow as RoboCop. Your sprint is a little better, but it's still very slow. You cannot jump, there are no cover mechanics, the level design, except a couple of occasions towards the end, is a funnel. There's no combat arenas, since that wouldn't make sense for a character that moves like this, and when the game tries them out, it's terrible. This isn't a game about strategizing and using your abilities to their best while choreographing an action movie. This game works much like some of those 2000s to 2010s FPS games, the James Bonds, the Project Snowblinds, Black, and even then, those were a little more open than this, which is why I compare it so much to Urban Chaos. The shooting segments here could be a light gun game, and they would lose a lot, but they would still function. I'm saying the design itself is very similar to that. You walk down a path and react to enemies. You click heads. You do get access to different abilities like dashing or turning on bullet time, and you can grab both enemies and objects and throw them around, and that can keep gameplay flashy and frenetic, but the crux of it all is walking down a path and shooting bad guys. And when that is done well, it can be just as engaging as anything else. If it doesn't overstay its welcome, that is, which here, it really doesn't. There are some pacing issues that I'll mention later on, but the game breaks up these sections with those dialogue and exploration heavy moments, so this will only be a problem if you don't like the idea of those sections. But as I said before, this game knows what it is, and feels like a game that always knew what it wanted to be. This never feels like an impediment or a limitation, or the result of something too ambitious being reined in. This feels like it was all designed to work this way from the start. So the game in response feels tight and fun, even if it isn't complex. And that mentality is applied to everything in the game, because oh boy is there actually a lot going on. If some games want to be as wide as an ocean but deep as a puddle, Starfield, this game is like 4 different puddles, but they're all perfectly calculated to be exactly as deep as they need to be, and placed in just the right spots. I mentioned different abilities that you get access to, but you get them by leveling up, and leveling up is simple. Play the game, complete objectives, explore thoroughly, and you get experience to level up. With big chunks of experience being given to you at the end of certain stretches of the game when you get evaluated at the police station. You then choose from your list of skills and prioritize whatever you want. Nothing is going to change the game fundamentally, but more deduction might get you better loot when exploring. Psychology will open up dialogue choices in conversations, or highlight the best ones available. Vitality and armor will help you survive, where engineering will let you dash, being more nimble, and also increase the damage of some modifications. Focus will let you slow down time when shooting. It's all pretty surface level, but it helps keep you engaged and thinking about what decisions to make, as well as motivates you to play in a way that maximizes your experience gains. And this is one of those puddles. Those open world, side quest, and dialogue heavy sequences, they often give you a choice to either serve for the public trust or to uphold the law. Public trust is mostly letting people off the hook for minor things, believing that they'll learn from the experience, or just showing empathy in general. And upholding the law is being a stickler for rules and making sure that crime goes punished, even if it's just the smallest of fines. And these decisions will affect the story later on, much like many of your answers during many conversations, especially ones with the main characters, or for example, the psychologist Olivia Blanche. And this is another puddle. But I might be getting a little bit too deep a little bit too quickly, so let's break down each element in context and talk about some of the amazing things that it does and some of the not so great things. So what is RoboCop Rogue City really about? If it's not really a shooter, it's more of a dialogue game. What is it? Well, it takes place between the second and third films, although you don't need to care, and it follows the literal dead man walking Alex Murphy, otherwise known as RoboCop. Alex died in the line of duty, but Omni Consumer Products, which also funds the police department, turned him into a half-man, half-machine of justice. The original film was quite heady in how it tackled many different topics, from capitalism, division of power, humanity, masculinity, ethics, artificial intelligence, gentrification, and many more things. Which I know is surprising for a movie called RoboCop about a cop who's also Robo, but it really did touch on all of these things way back when, and if you were under the impression that RoboCop is just some dumb action movie, it kind of is, but it isn't. It really does go a lot deeper. Now, while many of those same themes are present in the game, often very organically through conversations or context in a show of very competent writing, the main subject the game tackles is the character of Alex Murphy, which is great because Alex is a really good character, and also the one you play as. Listen, this won't win any awards for writing. This isn't the deepest character exploration this side of PlayStation Studios, but it's explored with enough weight to matter, to make you think, get its point across, but never be so heavy-handed that it breaks the overall 80s action movie blend of melodrama, cheap jokes, and cheesy one-liners. It is truly impressive how the game walks such a fine line most of the time, and while I think there are moments that people can find cringy, I found that most of them hit for me. It's funny, dramatic, clever, and knows how to tug on your heartstrings in a way that left me genuinely surprised when I found myself actually hating the characters that you're meant to hate. The combination of writing and performance here made me care, and I love that. But the main plot to be discovered, the real one aside from the conflict driver of, there's a big bad guy working with all the big bad gangs, we have to take him down, is the journey that Alex takes into rediscovering himself and understanding what he is. And it's a perfect example of that fine line. If you think about it, it's terrifying. This poor man who just wanted to be a cop is transplanted into a machine and now coexists with a computer that governs most of what he is, and people treat him like a strange ghost of a man that was, or simply as a thing that isn't alive. And the game opens up the dialogue of what it must be for him to exist in this state, the constant torture of not being yourself and not having free will, but at least you're alive and doing what you love, upholding the law. But how much is Alex in control? How much does he feel? Is he just a passenger in the machine, or is he a driver fighting against the road? And despite the absolute dread that can come from thought experiments like these, the game never makes it too heavy-handed, and instead makes it emotional in a way that you can easily empathize with Alex, but never asks too many uncomfortable questions as to ruin the mood. From the start, the story kicks off in all its hokey kitsch future 80s aesthetic with the news report that there's a new guy who is taking over the drug game in Detroit, just before the TV station is taken over by bad guys. You make your way through, showing them all the metal fist of the law, but after an explosion, Alex starts to have flashbacks to his relationship with his wife and his son that he left behind when becoming RoboCop. As Alex starts to malfunction on live TV, his functioning becomes a primary concern for all the citizens of Detroit, so Alex must undergo maintenance. This contextualizes the chip put into Alex to monitor his performance and the evaluations and points you get for missions, as well as your level up system. It also introduces the psychologist with whom you'll have conversations throughout the game, leading Alex more towards his robot side or his human side, depending on your answers. The police station where this all goes down is a space you'll get to know in your playthrough, as you regularly return and encounter new conversations, side quests, and activities each time. That way that you get to know a space and the characters in it and see how it changes is one of my favorite parts of this game, along with all the tiny meaningful details put into each of the explorable locations. And this sort of world building and contextualization throughout the game is so much more meaningful than it might seem on the surface. I wholeheartedly believe that this game is designed around telling Alex's story, and everything related to telling that story is done with care and intention. The problems arise with things around gameplay that aren't as fleshed out, and other elements of the story that aren't as important to Alex's key story and more just things that happen that aren't done nearly as well. The hub-based progression the game uses is an interesting one to say the least, although you will mostly spend time between the precinct and a singular hub in downtown Detroit that you revisit 4 times. The game has an important main thread to follow as you chase down the big bad guy and uncover the conspiracy and projects going on within OCP, but there are a set of long-running stories related to other characters, and these are Pickles, Ulysses Washington, who has a pretty funny ongoing joke where a different character, Becker, constantly calls him by the names of other Greeks like Achilles, Anne Lewis, which is Murphy's partner, Samantha Ortiz, although the game says it's Ortiz, a rebel journalist who wants to expose OCP, and Olivia Blanche, the psychiatrist assigned to evaluate Murphy. Each of these characters has side quests related to them, and your decisions in those side quests will lead to different outcomes for them at the end of the game, and all of them are at a minimum well written and often fantastic. And this core of the structure is what I think sets this game apart the most. When you think about this from the perspective of achieving a final goal, the decisions around the game's design become clearer. If the goal is to create a story set in the RoboCop universe, where his agency over who he is, his past and his future included, are the center point, you want to create situations that give players the ability to make decisions and exercise that agency. You could do this with a linear series of sequences that include decisions, but with more or less branching paths after them, but given budget and time, they would probably be simple, small variations. When you factor this in with another integral part of the experience, being creating an authentic RoboCop Detroit that gives the player a good sense of place and especially context for why their decisions matter, it makes so much more sense to create these open spaces of exploration and this cast of characters that you interact with. The player can make different decisions with those different characters and has much more freedom to express that agency than a traditional binary choose the good path or the bad one that most players commit to one or the other early on and never switch lanes. And you can set up all these interactions to happen in this small open world that lets players experience the setting on their own terms. Because the game structure is almost like chapters, you can section off each part of a character's story to progress along with the main story beats, and then open up again in the next chapter, with the open world giving you the freedom to create new spaces for those side stories to take place in if needed, and without breaking up the pace of the game. And each chapter moves all the stories forward, whether you interacted with them or not. My favorite character out of the entire cast here is Josh Pickles. He's a resourceful, kind-hearted drug addict that's also a police informant. He has a close relationship with Briggs, and during your initial search for the disappeared Briggs, he tags along and offers some side quests that shed light on his relationship with Briggs, as well as the type of men that both of them are, and how their relationship affects Briggs' family. He really does want to amend for some of his worse actions and do what's right for Briggs, and he's also a junkie, so a side mission later on has you accompany him to a video rental store as he can't recall the name of a movie, and has you chatting about film with some different options sprinkled in. RoboCop, and I guess most players, will see that Josh is a smart guy in a bad situation and want him to walk the straight and narrow, give him a chance, and some dialogue options even suggest him joining the Force, but he simply doesn't want to. He tells you, "I try very hard to not try at all." During this VHS mission, it turns out that the tape he was looking for was one that he overheard gang members had stashed money in while running from the police. And he wants that money to buy more nuke, which is the common recreational substance that people use in this world. When you find out the real motivations why he was looking for this specific tape, you can confront him on it. And at this point in the game, you've been through quite a lot of different stories with Pickles and have learned a lot about him and grown close to him. So it hits very hard when he asks you to stop being a police officer and instead be a friend. Something that rings so strongly given the journey of humanity that Alex is on. On my playthrough, I humanized Alex as much as possible, making all the choices that made him the most human. But this one just wasn't black and white for me. This one wasn't about just showing emotion, because you can leave Pickles with the money, and he will have tricked you, the same person that he calls friend, into helping him obtain drug money he's going to use for more of that. And yeah, he will appreciate that favor of you letting him keep it. But you can also answer, "I'm doing this as your friend," and take that money from him, as he tells you that you're never going to change who he is, and tells you to fuck off. This depiction of addiction, while not the deepest ever done obviously, has tact that truly caught me off guard, and I found myself grimacing at the choice. I took the drugs because I wanted what was best for Pickles, and I thought that was it, even if it's just in my self-righteous, self-centered mind. And it felt terrible to do that to him, and have him hate me. This was a decision that I pondered on and thought about later more than I've done with game decisions in a while. Something closer to choices I've made in Fallout New Vegas, or the best, most gray examples in Baldur's Gate 3. And this one is here, hidden inside a RoboCop license game that's a studio's second serious outing. And while RoboCop as a game has many issues that make it not exceptional, it's the collection of small nuggets of brilliance, both in its nostalgic game design sensibilities, and especially in its storytelling and world building, that makes me want to recommend this game to anyone willing to overlook the flaws and smile at the moments of genuine greatness nestled within. In a case where I must hand the compliments and complaints in equal fashion, the political through line in the game is the construction of Delta City and the three major players involved in it. At the center is OCP, Omni Consumer Products, the same people that fund the police and built RoboCop. They are the ones footing the bill for Delta City, a new development that promises a city without crime, without hunger, and without poverty, with a roof for everyone. The old man, that is his name, the head of the OCP, has some delusional but very good and real intentions. He truly wants to build a city where nobody suffers. But the construction of it comes with the need of evicting and taking over those ruined parts of the city, ruining the lives of those who are precisely the most impoverished, burning it all down and rebuilding from the ground up. Mayor Cusack opposes this construction and says that he fights for all the residents of Detroit, including Old Detroit, but he's also a shady scumbag, a hypocrite, and generally incompetent. Then on the other hand, in front of Cusack is John Mills, rich boy candidate with a family that used to be in politics, who supports Delta City and wants to win the election off the back of supporting RoboCop and the police. And he also seems to have good intentions, if a little less worried about those old Detroit citizens. The concept here is great because it presents a situation where you truly feel like every choice is bad, because they are. But you're also thrust into the spotlight of deciding who to support and having those consequences on your shoulders when in the end, they amount to nothing. And when confronted with it, you can kind of just chicken out with, and this is literally an option, Delta City shows promise if done right. It's like no shit, circuits for brains. So the story and the characters are mostly great, with some lows here and there, but my biggest problems are about the big bad plot you need to stop, the bad guys and their motivations, but not with Alex Murphy or any of the other characters with their stories. And because that is a more spoiler-heavy thing, I will cover it later on. For now, the real issue comes of asking questions of what our goal is to the combat system. See, what are you supposed to do in a RoboCop game? The obvious answer is to do what Teyon has done, a first-person shooter that puts you in the metal legs of the character as you slowly walk forward, mowing down bad guys. But the problems come with the most important question we must ask after that decision. How do you make that fun for 7 to 10 hours? Whenever you aren't talking to people and role-playing as Alex Murphy, you'll be shooting down bad guys, and Teyon has done an admirable attempt at keeping this gameplay varied and engaging, but the results aren't what I would like. Before we break down those problems, let's talk about the core mechanics that make up and support combat. Here's the total list of things you can do once you've unlocked them from leveling up. You can shoot from the hip or zoom in. You can walk and shoot, but this makes your spread larger. You can sprint, but can't shoot while sprinting. You can pick up items from around the environment and throw them. You can pick up enemies themselves and throw them. And you can pick up weapons from enemies, which is your only way of using other weapons. The abilities you gain access to are a dash, an AoE stun, bullet time, and an armor mode that greatly reduces damage. Your sidearm, the Auto 9, starts off very weak, but by finding PCB boards to slot into it, you can play a little puzzle minigame as you slot chips that you can also find around to complete the board, adding different effects and improvements, from accuracy and damage to extra gore, making it full auto, single shot, or just making it so that it doesn't need to reload. And that's it, that's all you can do. There's no mobility, rarely are there crazy weapons, there's no real set pieces, and only one whole boss fight in the game. There are other games that keep their formulas just as simple, but they have some added spice to round out the package. Titanfall has movement. Call of Duty has scripted set pieces and unique scenarios like sniping or stealth or turrets. Cyberpunk has freedom in its customizability and approach to encounters. Borderlands has a whole class-based RPG and number and loot chasing system, but RoboCop has nothing. The spectacle and novelty of walking straight towards bad guys and grabbing them and splatting them against the ceiling wears off quite quick, especially as the game ramps up in difficulty and demands more from the player. But the player always feels limited by the options available and the level design presented to them. Put simply, the more you play the game, the more that the combat sections feel like repetitive chores that you must complete before the next story beat is your reward. And towards the end, when combat really wants to challenge the player, design decisions turn it into encounters that are not fun, instead of encounters that ask you to maximize what you do have. As a note on how these encounters play out, I played the game on hard, which is one below the most difficult one and one above normal, and I recommend most people play the game on normal. Not because it's hard, it's not. It's just, it's more fun when you get to feel more like RoboCop. The game ramps up and adds diversity by introducing different enemy types and behaviors, as well as different arenas to fight in, but it ultimately fails in both of these. The enemy list expands from basic grunts to armored grunts, and from there it adds bomb grunts that blow up if they get close, broadcasters which can radio for backup and run away and hide, motorcyclists which drive around you in circles, and snipers. None of these really change the basic point-and-shoot gameplay, except for the motorcycle ones, which require better aim and awareness, and the snipers, which are just frustrating. They deal very high damage, blind you with their lasers, and you might not have the best weapon to deal with them at a given moment, making you have to walk up to shoot them. Sometimes there's cover to facilitate this, but other times you just have to walk through their damage. It didn't help that scoped weapons were bugged for me, possibly from a combination of resolution and FOV, and they just didn't shoot where I aimed. Normal crosshairs and weapons with zoom, but not scopes, were fine and pixel accurate, but scopes were just broken. Snipers get even worse later on, as many of the design philosophies in the levels change. Towards the last missions in the game, it tries to move from a primarily hallway-focused level design into larger arenas. But it does this while introducing two big differences in the enemies. You now also fight very tanky robots, sometimes in large amounts, and all of the other enemies are armored. These armored enemies need a very accurate shot to below their helmet, or multiple shots to knock the helmet off. The other option is to shoot their crotch, which is still a pretty easy instant critical hit. So here's the double whammy of mediocrity. When these new enemies are presented in the hallway style levels, they're the same as the previous enemies, except they have better weapons, and now the one-shot kill is in a different location. Except if their legs are behind cover, where they become annoying. When placed very far away, you have the same issue as before, where you need accurate long-range weapons for the one-shots, but they're often placed very far away and with cover for their legs, making them even more annoying, but even more if they're snipers. So remember how I said the game shifts to arenas? Well, let's talk about how these combinations make them a frustrating mess. Your mobility options are highly limited. Basically, you have your dash, which you might not even have depending on how you leveled, but you are being attacked from 3 to 5 different sight lines. Enemies will hit you and do damage, especially here in the late game, where guards on machine gun turrets, the robots and snipers just don't miss. There are also armored grunts that pressure you by simply walking at you, and normal grunts constantly throwing grenades to flush you out. This is really cool as far as combat design goes. If you had tools to fight this sort of encounter, it would be pretty fun as a combat sandbox. If I could jet boost out of there, or had different abilities, or a shield, or I could take height and switch vantage points, or cloak to escape a sticky situation. But none of that is available, and your health packs are limited, with a base regeneration up to 20% unless you took the vitality skills, which will increase that to 75%. So in a situation like this, how do you engage the enemies? Well, you can use your dash and your guard to mitigate damage and find a good position, often far away, to take down 1 or 2 enemies from safety. Wait for your cooldowns and repeat the process to whittle down the numbers. You can also stick to the same piece of cover and dance around grenades and melee enemies, pop out with your guard ability and take down as many as you can while it's up, go into cover, wait, and repeat. You cannot walk out and throw explosives or grab enemies and headshot opponents, because you will die. So this is no longer about the RoboCop fantasy. You are now facing odds that are greater than what the armored robot man can take. But that means the game devolves into a mediocre shooter where you feel limited. You can beat these encounters easily. There is no difficulty in taking cover, popping out, and repeating that same thing. The problem is that it's not fun, it's not unique, and there's nothing RoboCop about standing behind cover waiting for cooldowns because you ran out of health packs and there are 20 enemies left all shooting at you at all times. I think the leveling system and the PCB boards are there to increase your power level as the campaign goes on, so that even though the odds you face are larger, RoboCop is also stronger, keeping most of the gameplay and most of that feeling of power intact. But the balance is just off. At the end of the game, you feel underpowered and fragile against overwhelming odds. But the problem is that you're still RoboCop, the immobile tank of a man, and not a superpowered stealth guerrilla ninja. The scenario I'm describing and showing you is almost at the very end of the game, and this is the absolute worst case. But smaller versions of these issues can be seen elsewhere. Arenas against tons of robots that just aren't fun to fight. Hallways with machine guns that you just have to slowly walk down to take down the enemies. And when it's not presenting levels like these, the hallway light gun shooter gameplay does get old and repetitive, leading to a situation where you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. And I really do feel for the developers trying to make this work, because it's tough to do while staying true to the character and the vibe of the game. The combat sandbox here, enemy-wise and even in AI, is somewhere between competent and pretty damn good. But the issue is how that fits into what this game is. Maybe this is precisely the reason those straightforward arcade shooters I mentioned from before died out. The games before those mid-2000s shooters were early FPS games that now we call boomer shooters, and they relied on movement, and more recent modern iterations of that style double down, making most enemies use projectiles so that you can dance around and dodge. And that's where the heightened challenge comes from, with more movement, more precise shots required, and more weapon swapping. Modern FPS games use regenerating health to avoid the stress of resource management that punishes creativity, leading to a lot of gimmicks and gameplay variety. RoboCop is just there in the middle, both in design and in time. There's no great variety of weapons that you swap to at any moment, there's no crazy movement, there's no gimmick sections. Just the Tin Man and an ever-escalating level of threat that hampers the design of the game more and more as you reach the back half. More of the problems become apparent as the ambitions of the game and constraints in size as well as, I imagine, budget rub up against the grandiose designs and ever-escalating and progressing threats. Designing around the open hub is a definite win, but as the game's story stretches on, the hub gets reused a total of 4 times, with a smattering of new quests each time, including advancing those key character quests. While getting used to this small part of Detroit can be satisfying in the same way as learning the streets of Kamurocho and Yakuza, it's simply too small. Too isolated in the quote-unquote bad part of town to really be believable, and more importantly, it's too bland to be memorable. It's such a coincidence that so many events take place in this 3-block radius, and anytime something big is happening, we leave to a different part for more traditional levels. Not only does this repetition start to make repeat visits less exciting, but that nagging feeling that it's illogical for everything to be conveniently here starts to itch away, making you wonder what the rest of Detroit is like, and what are the other neighborhoods, and how would this game be if instead of having everything here, we could travel to those places. This might seem nitpicky, but the reuse of the area goes beyond placing everything that isn't a big location in this small area, since it's also the stage for one of the final levels where you run around the neighborhood taking down baddies in the street and revisit side quest locations now repopulated with enemies. In that stretch especially, not only is the repetition grating, but it feels kind of crazy that the mayoral election campaign victory is celebrated on a rinky-dink stage next to the river in the bad part of town, which has access to the bridge where the gangs set up bombs, but it's also just 2 blocks away from the super secret laboratory where the bad guys do their experiments. All on these 3 blocks, what a coincidence. The fun of the open world in RoboCop doesn't come from new activities and happenings, random events, or even secrets and unlockables. It comes from experiencing the city and looking at the wonderfully detailed environments. On your next 2 visits, you're just dashing from location to location to get to the next side quest area or main mission, since you've already seen what there is to see and you want to see something new. And the hub, especially if you thoroughly explored it the first time around, doesn't offer that. The new areas for side quests that open up, though, do, but they are sectioned off with loading screens from the hub, and in general all of these locations are beautifully done, including the hub that first time around. There are so many small details to admire. The police station has pictures of officers that are no longer with them. There's wanted posters and signs meticulously constructed, a whole host of gags on the trophy wall, including a trophy for RoboCop for being the best RoboCop ever. Gail Briggs, the wife of Policeman Briggs that you investigate in the story, has her tiny apartment littered with pictures and memories, and small believable details like this extension lead just haphazardly plugged in near the house entrance. And this sort of detail extends into the main missions and some of the storytelling as well. At the steel mill mission, when you're taking down the biker gang Vultures, Spike, the leader, taunts you with 2 different side missions. In one of them, he says that he has a stash of nuke totaling up to 15 boxes. You can go and destroy it and get some other rewards along the way. But in the second side mission, you can find the secret notes kept by the gang, where Spike listed and ordered the rest of the crew to burn those 15 boxes of nuke anyways, proving how he was just luring you into a trap, but if you survived it, you'd just be doing him a favor anyways. Even the video store I mentioned when speaking about Pickles has posters and VHS covers with analogs to real life and spoofs that make just looking around a joy. And it's what makes walking down the same streets with minimal changes over and over again so disappointing. This made me dream of a different, bigger game, but made by this same team. Something closer to a Fallout game, with a much larger open world, but with the same fantastic visuals and details in their environment design, with the same penchant for RPG mechanics, but without the constraints of being a RoboCop game, one with the same writing chops that caught me by genuine surprise and how affecting and well presented its dilemmas can be. But we didn't get that, at least not yet. We have the same 3 blocks of Detroit from which to dream of a better tomorrow. Where the story, the pacing, and the gameplay all begin to fall apart a bit is precisely as that repetition sets in, and the formula begins to show its limitations. As the game struggles to present fresh combat ideas and lead its many plot threads to a conclusion, the House of Cards falls apart. While avoiding spoilers, since the game is very new, the ending sequences really destroy the pacing that was already in danger. It's not the worst ever, but if you're pursuing all side quests for the characters, and especially if you do them before the main objectives in an area, sometimes there's a real sense of, why am I rescuing a cat when I need this other very important thing done, and it's also potentially time sensitive. And that feeling gets worse as the game goes on. Eventually, you'll barrel down a stretch with minimal side quests, starting around the mission called Wendell's Confession. So, starting here, spoilers up until the timestamp on screen, or the next chapter marking that it's spoiler-free. But I'll try and skip over some surprises and just concentrate on the main plot anyways, only going for the information necessary to highlight the problems I have and keeping the cool details that I promise you there are secret. It turns out Wendell Antonowski is the new guy, the one that the game starts with, who was earlier revealed to be the brother of the guy involved in Alex Murphy's death. And he has bigger ties than it might have seemed. After locking him up, you pay him a visit in jail, during which he escapes. This mission is mighty fun, since the enemies have basic weapons and no armor, so you get to go full RoboCop and destroy everyone in a prison riot. Until Wendell's new goons and the final tier of enemies show up, Wolfram. Hired mercenaries by Wendell, and some of those combat problems really start here about 2/3 into the game. The malfunctions that Alex suffers, his visions of his past and glitches, at least the important ones that make him unable to function, are not natural occurrences of his human and machine side in conflict. No, they're triggered by Wendell using a lighter with software of some kind specifically designed to screw up RoboCop. This is important because Wendell, as a character, is just mysteriously terrible. He's the big bad guy who works for other bad guys, you think, but not really. He's just the big bad guy in the end, but we never know how he got into this position, who allowed him to get there, nor why is he doing it. On paper, Wendell is hired by the Old Man, the creator and CEO of Omni Consumer Products, for a secret project called Afterlife. It's meant to make transplants like RoboCop a consumer good that you can purchase to live forever, although in much more human bodies. Wendell's criminal activities are tied to him obtaining bodies for these experiments, but that doesn't really explain why he's out for RoboCop. He has a whole spiel about getting rid of Alex's human side to make him perfect, to make him superior, but then he flip-flops on that. It's later revealed that he isn't the brother of Antonowski, and that it's all a cover to make RoboCop more emotional about the case. The lighter that he uses to control RoboCop was obviously given to him by OCP, and the chip that allows that lighter to control RoboCop was put into him by Max Becker, another main character that works for OCP, but So that raises suspicions on Becker being in cahoots and there being a conspiracy, but Becker really didn't know about this. So other people in OCP are the ones in cahoots to control RoboCop and keep him out of Project Afterlife. But who? Because the signs point to the Old Man, but he also loves RoboCop, and by the end, we know it wasn't him. So who and why? Becker, on the other hand, hates RoboCop. And he tries to install his robot army and get rid of the police and RoboCop entirely, and he takes over as the OCP CEO when the old man dies. But then Wendell says he's going to take over the whole company and control the robot, but then after everything goes up in flames, Wendell shows up and says he's going to take over the whole company and control the robots, and we still don't know who he is, or why he wants to do this, or like, where does he come from? Does he want something to do with Alex, which is the thing he says at the start? Or is it just a matter of keeping him in check to protect the project? Because he did a really bad job of that. Is he just a lackey who just very quickly wants more once the old man and Becker are out of the picture? I don't know anymore. And then he dies, and that's it. And it's a confusing mess. And it's a huge letdown of a main villain. It's a convoluted, unclear plot that tries to keep making twists and turns and cast suspicion on other characters as the big bad. And sometimes it can become a mess of motivations and reasons, with Samantha, the news reporter, and the two mayoral candidates, and the cluster cluck within OCP. And while that chaos can be fun in how it disorients you when looking for who is truly guilty of what, it fails to properly explain everyone and give you a final clear picture. As Wendell escapes, you get caught up in the mayoral elections, and you also have to confront the old man. Turns out he's dead, and Project Afterlife is cancelled. Just like that, you just show up, and apparently the police were the last to know. So Max Becker is now the CEO, and he needs you, RoboCop, for the presentation of his new robots that are going to replace you. And they, of course, all go haywire, followed by more of Wendell's antics and then absolute mayhem exploding into gang activity in the city the night of the elections, culminating in the final investigation into the labs and chasing down Wendell. But we're not done. Oh no, one final stop. After all of this, we have to head back to OCP for a final boss fight against the old man, who has been transplanted into RoboCop 2 in his pursuit of not dying and being like RoboCop. But he's also going haywire and turned violent, destroying OCP and killing everyone. There's no meaning to the larger plot here, because this isn't Project Afterlife, it's Project RoboCop, and the only intention is that he doesn't want to die. So you confront RoboCop 2 in a pretty decent boss fight, and are left with a final choice. You can kill him, let him die, or save him. And this decision can lock certain characters' outcomes into bad ones no matter what you've done before. The good ending, obviously, is to save him. It's a story about becoming human, showing empathy, and using better judgment instead of being a machine. It's about believing that humanity persists in machines, so you must save him. And if you do, right afterwards, the old man sacrifices himself to push you out of the way of another falling piece of building, and ending his life anyways, but with a nice message in there. After this OCP, the entire building collapses, setting up the groundwork for what will happen in the third film in the series. It's a confusing mess. It's not properly tied in. It feels like there were multiple endings planned and they were all crammed together, especially with the kind of separate epilogue-like final boss with the old man. It's not terrible, it didn't make me hate the game, but the last impression it leaves you with isn't strictly positive, and becomes worse the more you think about it, when so many other things in the game, the more I think about them, the more I like them. I do want to mention, as I said before, that while all of these plot points related to the bad guys and all the conspiracy plot is handled pretty poorly, the value of the game isn't there. It's in Alex Murphy and his relationships with all the other characters. So it stings, of course, but it's not where the real value of the game lies. The real epilogue shows you the result of your actions and all the other storylines of the characters with two different possible outcomes for them in these cute, funny vignettes on the news, and then the credits roll. RoboCop Rogue City perfectly captures what I described of those mid-tier games at the start of this video. It's bright and bubbly and filled with heart, creativity, and ambition, but it's also not a 10 out of 10 game. Its technical chops with Unreal Engine 5 produce environments that are beautiful to look at. Its reverence for the source material and aesthetics, both visual and in its audio design, and its soundtrack are palpable, tasteful, and lovable. Its character writing, structure, and how unique it is when compared to other games makes it a breath of fresh air whether you're a fan of RoboCop or not. And it's also a pretty okay middling shooter. a slightly constrained RPG, and a weirdly paced, often puzzling narrative adventure, and not in the good puzzle type of way. And despite all of these problems, I can't sit here and not recommend it. It's a game that has soul. It has purpose, vision, and intention behind its very conception. Sure, it has problems, and you should be aware of them, but the overall experience for me is positive. I love games where there's no effort required in playing through them. I'm not talking about difficulty, that's a different conversation. I mean that you never even doubt booting them up or picking up your controller. Games where there's never a moment where you hesitate in being in that world and seeing what's next. Those games are few and far between, and RoboCop is not one of them. You will be frustrated from time to time, confused at other moments, and bogged down by things you don't want to do at that time, but you feel you must do because of the pacing and the side quests. And in all of those moments, it's easy to put down the controller and stop. But every time I didn't, I was rewarded with something that made me laugh, or made me think, and that's very rare to find in games, and much more so in games as experimental as these. It's a unique gem for a new era, a licensed game that wants to be what it is and that takes advantage of it, a AA game that deserves to be AAA one day, and a game that made me smile a whole lot. RoboCop might not take home any awards, but I strongly believe it's a game that many people will hold near and dear in their hearts, and a reference point for a type of game that, while long forgotten, is finally being remembered. I can't tell you that it's worth it for you, and I can't recommend it without reservations, but that's why my reviews aren't 15 minutes long with a number at the end of them. Because I'm here to talk about games, to share my experiences and thoughts if I believe that they're worth sharing, and I hope that from that, you can decide for yourself if RoboCop Rogue City is a game for you. By the end of my journey, the smile might have faded, but just like a beautiful relationship with a bad breakup, on review there was way more to love than there was to complain about. Thank you so much for watching, and if you made it all the way to the end, leave a comment saying you knew there was going to be trouble, and I'll heart every single one of them. These videos take a very long time and a ton of effort to create, and for you to make it here is all I could ever ask for, even if it's just one person. My hope is to become a creator that one day, no matter what I decide to talk about, people will watch it because they trust me to have something interesting and worthwhile to say. And if you want to join me on that journey, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. I promise to do my best in creating the quality content that I would like to watch myself. We're almost at 10,000 subscribers, and that number would make a heck of a Christmas present. Next up is my biggest, most ambitious project yet, and trust me, chooms, you don't want to miss it. I've been Mugthief, keep your coffee mug safe, and I'll see you very soon.